You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa. Good day, everyone, and welcome to The Sacred Sofa, where my co-host Grace and I continue to be on a quest to find the good and flourishing life. And today, once again, we are using Jesus's Sermon on the Mount as an exploration of that, adding in a little psychology and therapy, of course. And so the Sermon on the Mount is going to throw a little wrench at us. But Grace, thanks for joining me as always. How are you doing?
Hello, Brad. I'm doing well. And as always, it's great to explore the Jesus path with you and also to explore that using the lens of psychotherapy and psychology. Excited to dive into this topic with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited as well, Grace, because this one can seem a little unsettling at first glance. So why don't we just jump right into it, shall we? Part of the sermon in Matthew 5, Jesus says this, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." Well, Grace, we have talked a lot on this podcast about the need for appropriate boundaries. And at first glance, this teaching seems like it could very easily be a recipe for, I would say, getting walked over in life and people seeing you as maybe a bit of a sucker. So, Grace, when you initially read this, when you look at this instruction from Jesus with a therapeutic lens, what is going on here?
Now, agreed. Taken out of context, this absolutely sounds like a recipe for harmful behavior and abuse. Well, what I read here is, I believe, more in line with being peacekeepers. See, when we're offended, it's natural to want to seek retribution, but Jesus is actually calling us to pursue peace. And to pursue peace, it's not passive. It absolutely requires intention and an ongoing commitment. And I would say, in the same way, creating and maintaining healthy boundaries with self and others is an active and intentional work. Now, to you, Brad, I want to talk about an often heard Gandhi quote, also used by Martin Luther King Jr. And the quote says that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. What is probably less known is that the law that this quote speaks about. And so I'm wondering if you could give us a bit of history of this law.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think Gandhi's completely right, of course, but there's a context here. So let me unpack it a little bit. The beginning of Genesis 4, there's a story that gets ignored a lot, but I think it's quite interesting. It's the story of Lamech. And Lamech tells his wives, he's married to 2 wives, he tells them that he killed a man for injuring him. He hurt somebody worse than they hurt him. So he's basically talking about how when he gets his vengeance, he gets it 77 times. Now, that's an interesting number. Jesus will use that in terms of forgiveness. But I think the deeper part of the story is that Lamech is, in the Genesis account, really kind of a sit-in, an archetype for a very common human tendency, which is whenever we're hurt, to hurt the other person back even further. And so when you start to see civilizations starting to form and create themselves, there's a problem, because if you've got Lamech as the sort of litmus test here, it's hard to run a civilization if every time somebody gets hurt, they're getting hurt worse. So what happens is
start running out of citizens.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So this is kind of vigilante justice. And so early, we're talking 1755 BC, we see the first written rules of law, so to speak. And it's the Code of Hammurabi. That's the earliest set of laws that we know exist. You can actually find the Code of Hammurabi in the Louvre in Paris. And it's the first time that we get this idea of eye for eye. And the idea is if you knock out a free man's eye, I find that very interesting.
Hmm.
Says nothing about the lower classes. You
Mm-hmm.
knock out a free man's eye, then of course your eye is going to be plucked out. You knock out their tooth, same thing's going to happen to you. So there's at least a balance here that justice should be proportional. The
Mm-hmm.
Mosaic Law, the Bible that we get, shows up 250 years later, essentially says the same thing: eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And these sort of laws are what we call lex talionis laws, which means law according to kind, proportional punishment. The punishment should fit the crime. That sort of
Mm-hmm.
idea. Now, the point of these seemingly harsh and violent laws are they're trying to be positive, not negative, even though we read it that way. And they represent a major step forward for humanity. Because while we might not like the wording of it, there is an
Mm-hmm.
attempt here to say, hey, we can't just go out and be killing everyone who hurts us or flips us off
Mm-hmm.
in traffic, right? So we've got
Right,
to keep
right.
it proportional. And so even today, most countries in international law still operate on some kind of similar thinking and understanding. When an injury, offense, or crime is committed, how do we govern a response to that? Well, the idea is by handing out a punishment that fits the crime. And the idea was to keep two things in check. First, it prevented severe retribution that didn't fit the crime. And the second point was to keep us from self appointed vigilante action. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what's going on. That's the context behind it.
And that makes sense because even in our Canadian laws, we have the same um, kind of guidelines in terms of proportionality. The punishment should be proportional to the seriousness of the offense as well as the offender's guilt.
Mm.
So that makes sense, even in our modern day laws.
Yeah, and I mean, you look internationally, right? And I certainly don't want to get into all the nuance of that, but we're seeing this play out Ukraine, Russia, with Israel and Gaza, right? Like everyone going, what is the proportional response here? How do we keep this from escalating? At least trying to have those conversations, maybe not very successfully, but
Mm-hmm.
still, it's meant to govern people groups, nations. The idea is appropriate consequences for wrong committed.
Mm-hmm.
But Grace, what I find interesting here is that Jesus moves this from sort of macro to micro, the collective whole, nations to personal. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think on a societal level, he's saying that there should be no consequences for wrongs. And we might
Okay.
think, okay, fair enough. When someone commits a crime, the punishment should be fair to the damage caused.
Mm-hmm.
But when you move to the personal, I think this starts to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you stay it just on paper, it starts to fall apart. If I cheat on my spouse, should the consequence be my partner gets to cheat on me? I mean, that starts
Mm-hmm.
to fall apart. Or if a friend says an unkind word to me, is the consequence I get to say something nasty about them as well? You see how this doesn't work on a personal level. So it's just a recipe, I think, for perpetuating harm in life. And I really think that's what Jesus is getting at. If applied to personal harms, we're
Hmm.
simply going to end up with more harm.
Yes.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
before we explore what Jesus recommends, though, Grace, I'm curious to know your thoughts on this because, on a personal level, when wrongs are done to me, like how should I conceive of consequences? Like, how should I even internalize that?
Hmm.
Or I'm curious, particularly in your line of work, when one party has clearly wronged another, what consequences should there be, if any? And how do you approach that with the clients you work with?
Mm-hmm. So I'll talk a bit personal and professional. And for me, I think it's both, to be honest. For me, that goes hand in hand on a personal level. And as I work with clients professionally, I'm thinking about what I might consider a moral offense versus a legal offense.
Mm,
Someone could wrong me in a way that offends me personally or socially, but it's not illegal. So I would
right.
suspect that's going to be a different response.
Mm.
But either way, I do want it to be proportionate,
Mm, yeah.
because I want to receive a proportional consequence. Um, when I'm feeling petty or vengeful, it'll be more likely I'll respond disproportionately. And so sometimes folks offend due to a lack of knowledge. And so my response to that is to verbalize what the boundary is,
Mm.
So, if you're not a touchy person and I'm a huggy person and I hug you, you can verbally say, you know what, I would not prefer that. Right.
Yeah.
That's proportionate. You just verbalizing what the boundary is. Now, if a person persists in creating harm or breaching the boundary, then the consequences of the relationship may need to be more on the spectrum from distance to disconnection. And so
Mm.
I think it's also important in the boundaries work to know that boundaries can change with new information.
Mm. Absolutely. Can you before we move on, is this something you deal with a lot? Like I'm just thinking of a married couple, let's say. Is there often a want, a desire for some sort of retribution when things go wrong?
Uh, Not that folks declare to me.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe in their mind or in their heart, they're feeling super vengeful or angry and just like, but they don't tend to disclose that to me.
Mm-hmm.
I actually find that I work more with folks on their what I call misplaced guilt in feeling, okay, I want to step away from this person, or I may not want to continue this relationship, but they feel guilty about actually
Uh,
acknowledging those feelings. So I tend to do more work along those lines versus the other saying, okay, stand down. I don't tend to get that in the
yeah.
therapeutic space.
Hmm. Hmm.
So let's start wading through Jesus' advice, Brad, and the illustrations that you're going to be talking about later. What exactly is at work with these ideas and the examples about turning the other cheek and so on? I'm curious if there's a way to understand, is this literal or figurative? Like, where do we land with these things?
Yeah, I think again, motivation should be in mind here because remember, for Jesus, the flourishing life is found in congruence between our inner and outer worlds. And so I think Jesus is asking us to do some real gut work here and examine our motives because our desire, I think, for personal justice can, if we're not in touch with our inner motivations, it can be a mass desire for punishment and vengeance. And I think a lot of times we're maybe more like Lamech than we're willing to admit. We want to hurt
Mm-hmm.
somebody more than they've hurt us. And so I think we would be wise to not allow ourselves to be tempted into thinking, I am the rightful distributor of justice. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. We don't let, in our court systems, for good or ill, we don't let victims choose what the punishment is, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think there's probably some good reasons for that
I
because
would suggest.
the desire for vengeance is a human impulse that I would say can't be trusted or it
Mm-hmm.
needs to be looked at real carefully because it can spiral out of control just way too easily.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what Jesus is getting at here, because a lot of people stumble on this, it really does sound like a recipe for being uh, getting walked all over. But
Mm-hmm.
I think Jesus is being hyperbolic here, and we've already seen him employ hyperbole earlier in the lust conversation where he says, gouge out your eye, cut off your hand, right? He's
Mm-hmm.
already used hyperbole. And so I think he's doing that again here, kind of going to this extreme length. But I call this, Grace, hopefully, people are familiar with Seinfeld. I call this the George Costanza principle. Now, for if anyone remembers the show, basically every instinct George has in life is wrong. And in one episode, right, he realizes his
Mm-hmm.
everything he does in life is the exact opposite of what he wants. And so he starts to do the opposite of his instinct. Things start to go very well for him.
Okay.
And I think it's similar here. I
Mm-hmm.
think what Jesus is getting at, listen, our instincts as humans around vengeance are like Lamech. It's rarely proportional, often
Mm-hmm.
spirals out of control, and so that impulse cannot be trusted. And so in the heat of the moment, Jesus and Paul, I think, have the same advice on this. When we're injured or hurt or tempted to do vengeance, like George, do the opposite of what our instincts tell us to do when we're wronged, at least in the heat of the moment, right? Because that's, I think,
Mm-hmm.
when we're most prone to do something out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And so do the opposite. So and again, I don't know how literally I would take this, but I think Jesus
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
using these as examples. If you get slapped, you want to slap back right away. Like we would go into fight mode or run mode, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
but the instinct might be there to slap back harder. Do the
Mm-hmm.
opposite, turn the other cheek. Someone tries to take your shirt, you're going to want to fight them, seek harm to that person. Do the opposite, give them your coat. Forced to walk a mile, go two, on and on it goes. So I
Mm-hmm.
think, at least from my perspective, the point is clear and applicable, I think, across time. It can seem counterintuitive and opposite of our impulses, but sometimes the right thing is to just accept being wronged, at least in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the just thing is not to seek our own justice.
I find this really, really good. And as I'm reflecting on these hyperbolic examples, I'm thinking what's the word? There's a moral here underneath of it. It's like if you
Mm,
get slapped, there's physical harm or whatever, you have a choice in that moment. And, walking away may seem harder just depending on the belief system you're trying to operate under. And all of these things, I would suggest don't happen in the moment. I think
mm,
to be successful in not being pursuing vengeance and retribution would take um it would be making sure you know what your values are before you encounter that situation.
right.
So I'm going to use again a very dramatic example. Remember years and years ago there was the shooting in Columbine, and
Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
remember that? And there was all these, and I don't know if they were true or not, but there was these rumors floating around about people who had been asked before they were killed, did they believe in God? Would they,
Right.
you know, renounce God or die, sort of thing. Don't know if these
Hmm.
actually happened, but I
Yeah.
did ponder that. And I remember a speaker on the radio uh, reflecting on all of the tragedy in the news. And he said, you know what, if that was true, those people who were faced with that choice, they would have had to have a belief system in the moment, long before that moment, that would help them decide. Like,
Mm,
does that make sense what I'm saying?
absolutely. It does.
If they said, you know what, I'm going to die, I know where I'm going, that's a belief system. That's a path they've been walking long before this incident happened. And I
Absolutely.
think the same with this example that Jesus is using in terms of, turn the other cheek. You would have to be locked into a belief system. You would have to be locked into this belief that it is more valuable for me to pursue peace than my own
Mm.
way and having my own justice and satisfaction. Hmm.
Yeah, you know what? That reminds me too, Grace. I about 6 months ago read the most recent biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And what astounded me, I think, was the amount of training that went into their nonviolent resistance. It wasn't just, hey, we're gonna go march and hey, nobody
Mm-hmm.
strike back. Like there was discipline, there was training for it because not easy in the moment. You've got to have a real strong backbone to be able to
Mm-hmm.
not respond to certain things. And so I think that's a really valid point that, if we wait till we get slapped in order to make that
Mm-hmm.
decision, we're probably going to slap back. We need to have
Mm-hmm.
values driving that. So yeah, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a really good point, Grace. And I'm curious when dealing with clients, what do you advise them when it comes to I don't know. I mean, obviously we're not talking about hopefully if there is a slapping situation with a couple, that's a different cup of tea
Mm-hmm.
there. But how do you talk to your clients about this? Maybe making their values before the heat of the moment comes. Like, what do you say to them?
Mm-hmm. And, I do actually quite a bit of work in terms of helping them identify. So if there's been a harm, a betrayal, we've talked in previous episodes, I work with couples who've been harmed in terms of betrayal, infidelity, those sort of things, which is really deep wounds. And there's a lot of wrestling with not about, oh, how do I make my partner pay? Like, do I cheat too? That it's not that kind of thing. The wrestling is,
Right.
do I stay or do I go?
Mm,
And because that speaks to me of value of the relationship. If it wasn't important, you'd be out the door already. And so we explore
Right.
that. And then we also explore, what are the values that are influencing their decision to stay or to go. And so there is this huge foundational work underneath to bring to the surface, why is this important? What would be the impetus for them to continue in this relationship? I don't often see, like I mentioned before, couples talking about how to seek vengeance on each other.
Mm,
It's really more about misplaced guilt in terms of
yeah.
feeling like they should stay, even though their heart is broken and they're devastated. And so a lot of the work is highlighting this intricate balance between, okay, your needs matter, your needs are important. How do you create healthy boundaries? But also hold the person to accountability as well. It's very
Mm,
interesting, intricate work for sure.
yeah, absolutely. Grace, speaking of Martin Luther King Jr., I wanted uh, to maybe bring the episode to a close with a quote from him that I found fascinating.
Hmm.
With this quote, he was speaking at the time to practicing the way of nonviolence, but I think his words speak to something much larger than that,
Hmm.
and they speak towards our desire for vengeance. And what I find interesting here is that he points out that the desire for vengeance is not only impractical but also immoral, and I don't think I had thought about those two elements before. And
Hmm.
of course, he picks up on that original Gandhi quote, but this is what he said: violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. It is impractical because it's a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. The old law of an eye for eye leaves everybody blind.
Hmm.
But it's also immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert. I
Hmm.
really like how he gets at that because I haven't faced, physical violence per se, but I have been injured and definitely felt the urge to humiliate or to want to
Hmm.
see the other person
Hmm.
not seen in a good life. And so I think he really gets here underneath what can sometimes be happening inside of us. So,
Hmm.
on the one hand, it's like it's not practical because everyone's going to end up blind, but it's also immoral when what we're seeking for the person who injured us is to humiliate or annihilate them. And I think
Hmm.
that's important. But Grace, could you maybe reflect a little on that as
Hmm.
well as we close, especially in terms of the work you do with clients?
Hmm. Yes, and in some of this boundary work, in the healing work, I often have opportunities to guide folks into reflections around such powerful concepts as we're talking about: anger, forgiveness, healthy boundaries, and even reconciliation. And a lot of the work I do is around the practice of teaching people how to fight fair, which, sounds odd, but we see that in so many. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if you were on Netflix this weekend watching this fight
Yeah.
between, right?
I was, yes.
But what's the ref there doing? He already at the
Hmm.
beginning said, okay, blows have to be above the belt,
Yeah.
like that's
Yep.
teaching them how to fight fair.
Yes.
And I take a lot from Dr. John and Julie Gottman's work, where they talk about conflict is inevitable, combat is optional.
Mm.
In all our relationships, if we're viewing each other as the problem or the enemy or as the other rather than a problem to be solved, conflict is going to escalate and the need to make the other person pay quickly takes over.
Mm.
So, in the work that I do, we explore ways to come to conflict as allies rather than enemies with the goal of win win. And that was so much about Martin Luther King Jr.'s view of the nonviolent way through the civil
Mm.
rights movement. It was like, can we be allies to this enemy of racial injustice with the goal of it being win win for all of humanity? And
Right.
so, with that lens, conflict is greatly reduced, as is the collateral damage that can come from combat. And
Mm.
folks can then start to enjoy peaceful and flourishing relationships. And I believe that's so important for us to be mindful that Jesus continually invites us to be ambassadors for love. Listen, Jesus also knows that we are on a journey to keep growing into our ability to love our enemies. We're
Mm.
growing in our ability to love our enemies just as we love our neighbors.
Mm. That's I just want to reflect for a second there on the Gottmans because they did a world of favor to me because I think early in some of my relationships, uh Grace, I felt guilty for conflict at all. Just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I hate that I have conflict, that my partner and I are arguing, having a fight. And there was just a guilt there. But the Gottman's ability to help me see, whoa, conflict is inevitable. That's going to happen. It's how you do that. And it doesn't have to be combat. And that idea
Mm-hmm.
of fighting fair, what are the guidelines? What are the rules here? What are the things we're both going to agree not to say? Because again, there's been times where I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes your intimate partners, friends, spouse, whatever, they have the words and the ability to humiliate and hurt you more than anyone because they know all your
Mm-hmm.
little ticks, all your quirks, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
there's a temptation sometimes to want to pull those cards when you're in conflict, right? Send
Mm-hmm.
that word that hurts, that stings a little. And so there's something really beautiful there about normalizing conflict, but making sure we're fighting fair and not moving into combat. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's really great.
That's great. And that takes us back to the beginning of our episode. These laws that we still, in so many ways, glean our modern laws from. It was about that. It's like, how
Mm.
do we see each other's humanity rather than just vengeance and chaos? And so, still the same battles we're fighting today in
Yeah.
words of ourselves and with each other. And so,
Mm.
but we can't give up. We can't give up on this pursuit of peace and that good and flourishing life.
Absolutely, Grace. And that seems like a good place to end this episode. Keep moving, keep striving, keep trying towards the flourishing life. Thanks again, Grace, for your wisdom as always.
And yours too, Brad. Thanks. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.